What would you do if the very moment you wanted to protect your child turned into the moment the world tried to silence you? Picture yourself on a plane, thousands of feet in the air, when a flight attendant suddenly raises her voice at your teenage daughter, shaming her in front of strangers. Your daughter's eyes fill with fear, and every instinct in you says this is wrong. But here's the choice. Do you stay quiet, hoping the storm will pass, or do you take a stand, knowing the price might be heavy? This isn't just about one girl being shouted at. It's about a line that no parent should ever have to cross the line between silence and action. One father made a call that not only changed his daughter's life, but brought an entire plane to a standstill. Now, imagine if it were you. Would you have the strength to make that call? Would you carry the weight of truth when everyone's eyes were on you? This is their story, a story of injustice, courage, and a decision that grounded more than a plane. It grounded a nation's silence. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel before we dive in. The air inside the cabin was calm, almost too calm. A low hum of the engines wrapped around the passengers like a lullaby. Laptops flickered open. Children pressed their faces against small oval windows, and flight attendants moved briskly down the aisles, rehearsing the familiar rhythm of safety checks and polite smiles. Everything seemed ordinary until it wasn't. A sharp crackle broke through the silence. The intercom hissed. Then the captain's steady voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone unusually measured, "we've been instructed to return to the gate immediately. Please remain seated." The words dropped like stones. For a moment, the passengers froze, unsure they had heard correctly. Then came the inevitable ripple of murmurs, sharp intakes of breath, nervous laughter. Someone asked aloud, "Did he say, 'Return'?" Another voice, "What's going on?" A man in row 12 pushed his glasses higher and muttered, "This never happens unless it's serious." Eyes darted across the cabin. Mothers clutched their children closer. Businessmen frowned at their watches. There was confusion, yes, but also fear, the kind that arrives when the predictable machinery of travel suddenly slips off track. And in the middle of that quiet chaos sat a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark skin and calm eyes. His suit jacket was neatly folded over his lap. Next to him, a teenage girl pressed her lips together, gripping his hand tightly. She was slender, with a notebook tucked under her arm and determination in her gaze, though her knuckles trembled where they touched his. The man did not move. He did not join in the whispers or exchange nervous glances. He sat still, breathing evenly, like a man who had trained himself to stay composed in the face of storms. Because Malcolm Reed had seen storms before. Around him, passengers wondered aloud: bomb threat, mechanical failure, a sick traveler. No one could guess the truth that a single moment of cruelty, a single flash of arrogance from a flight attendant, had set into motion a chain of events that would ground not just this plane, but shake the airline itself. The teenage girl beside him, Ava, tilted her head slightly. Her father's face was unreadable, his jaw firm, his eyes fixed ahead. She whispered, her voice almost inaudible under the roar of the engines, "Dad, are we in trouble?" Malcolm turned, just enough to meet her eyes. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "We're not the ones in trouble." He squeezed her hand gently, like a signal both reassurance and warning. For the rest of the passengers, the announcement was a mystery. For Malcolm, it was confirmation. The system had finally listened. One call, made moments earlier in a voice as steady as stone, had turned the plane around. But this story does not begin here. with the engines slowing and the passengers whispering. No. It begins earlier, before the gate had even closed, before the captain's voice rang out, before the eyes of the world turned toward one quiet man and his daughter. It begins with an encounter, a flight attendant, a teenager, a moment of humiliation that should have been small, ordinary, forgettable, yet wasn't, because dignity, once taken, can ripple into something unstoppable, because sometimes the loudest storms are born from a single, quiet refusal. Passengers would later remember the strange silence in the cabin after the announcement, the way time seemed to hang in the air, the way one girl's eyes filled with both fear and something else, something fiercer, and they would remember him, Malcolm Reed, sitting still, breathing evenly, a man who knew the weight of restraint and the power of patience. He looked calm, yes, but inside, a fire had been lit. Malcolm Reed was not the kind of man who liked attention. He had built a life on discipline, quiet persistence, and the ability to see opportunities where others saw only dead ends. Born on the south side of Atlanta, he had grown up in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled of laundry detergent and fried chicken, where the hum of his mother's sewing machine was as steady as any lullaby. His father had died in an accident when Malcolm was 8, leaving behind nothing but a battered toolbox and a stack of unpaid bills. His mother, Deborah Reed, carried the family with the weight of her hands sewing, cleaning, doing whatever work she could find. From her, Malcolm learned endurance. He learned that dignity was not about what people gave you, but what you refused to surrender. She used to say, "Son, the world will call you names. It will try to make you small. Don't let it. Walk tall, even when you're tired." By the time he turned 18, Malcolm had already been called small, poor, too ambitious, too black for certain neighborhoods, too serious for certain circles. But he had also been called brilliant, determined, relentless, those words he held onto like lifelines. He studied computer science at Georgia Tech on a scholarship, spent nights coding on borrowed computers, and after graduation, he built his first company out of a cramped storage room behind a friend's barber shop. That company grew, then grew again. Today, Reed Systems was a leading provider of secure data infrastructure, a backbone for airlines, hospitals, and financial institutions. It wasn't flashy work, but it was critical, and Malcolm had become known as a CEO who didn't just talk about responsibility, he practiced it. Yet success had not softened him. If anything, it sharpened his awareness of how often dignity was denied. He had watched investors assume his white partners were in charge while he was the assistant. He had been stopped at luxury hotels, asked if he was lost. He had been questioned at airports, again and again, as though his skin were a passport that could never be stamped. Each time, he answered with patience, with composure. But patience did not erase the wound. That morning, when Malcolm and his daughter Ava arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, he carried not just luggage, but the quiet weight of memory. Ava was the reason he had agreed to take this flight. At 15, she had just been invited to New York to interview for a science scholarship program that could shape her future. Ava dreamed of becoming a surgeon, and Malcolm had promised her that no barrier, financial, social, or systemic, would stand in her way. She walked through the terminal with her hair braided neatly, a backpack slung over one shoulder, a thick science journal tucked under her arm. Her eyes scanned the signs, the crowds, the wide glass windows that reflected endless lines of planes. She was nervous, but also excited. This was her first time flying, and she wanted to remember every detail. "Dad," she whispered as they waited to check in, It feels like the whole world is moving out there. Malcolm smiled, his voice warm. That's because it is, and you're going to be part of it. The check-in line moved slowly. Malcolm noticed how the clerk glanced twice at his ticket, then again at his ID. A white businessman behind him, ticket in the same class, was processed in under a minute. Malcolm's took 5. Ava frowned, sensing it, but Malcolm only rested a steady hand on her shoulder. When they passed through security, the pattern repeated. A random search, extra questioning. Malcolm kept his expression neutral, though inside, he felt the old sting, the reminder that no achievement could shield him completely. Ava watched closely. She was young, but not naive. She had grown up hearing his stories, seeing the way the world shifted when he entered certain rooms. She knew what was happening, even if no one said it aloud. Once through the gate, they found their seats in the first-class section. Ava looked around, wide-eyed at the larger seats, the soft pillows, the glow of the cabin lights. For her, this was luxury beyond imagination. For Malcolm, it was just another place where respect could be tested. He settled in, reminding himself to stay calm, to focus on Ava's future, not the ghosts of his past. As the minutes ticked by, Malcolm thought of the journey that had brought them here. He remembered nights coding alone, the sound of his mother coughing in the next room, the ache of wanting to prove that he could build something bigger than his beginnings. He remembered the investors who told him no, the journalists who called his success luck, the moments when walking into a boardroom felt like walking into a battlefield. And he remembered the victories signing contracts that gave jobs to thousands, creating scholarships for students who looked like him, sitting across from CEOs who once doubted him and watching them sign his deals. All of that, he knew, had prepared him for the quiet battles too, the ones that did not take place in boardrooms or coding labs, but in everyday moments, at airports, in restaurants, on airplanes. Ava shifted in her seat, nervous. Do you think they'll like me, Dad? At the scholarship interview. Malcolm turned to her, his gaze soft. Ava, they'd be lucky to meet you. Don't spend your energy on being liked. Spend it on being you. That's more than enough. She smiled faintly, but there was doubt in her eyes. He saw it. He recognized it. The same doubt he had carried, years ago, when he wondered if he belonged in spaces that seemed designed to exclude him. He reached for her hand, squeezed it once. You belong everywhere your talent and your heart can take you, he said firmly. Remember that. For Malcolm, every trip, every encounter, was a lesson he wanted Ava to carry with her. He knew he could not protect her from everything, but he could give her tools, calm, resilience, dignity that might serve her when the world tried to shrink her. The engines hummed as the plane prepared for takeoff. Ava leaned back against the seat, her journal open, her pen tapping lightly against the page. She was trying to distract herself by sketching diagrams of the human brain, lines and arrows curling across the paper. Malcolm watched her, pride swelling quietly in his chest. This was why he endured the long battles, the small indignities, so she could have a future wider than his past. What he did not know, what neither of them could know, was how quickly this flight would test them both, and how, within hours. Ava would not only face humiliation, but also witness the strength that her father had carried all his life. The boarding call echoed through the terminal, a polite yet firm reminder that the flight to New York was ready for final passengers. Malcolm rose with ease, his hand on Ava's shoulder, guiding her through the small crowd that pressed forward. Ava clutched her boarding pass tightly, excitement flickering across her face, though there was a shadow in her eyes from the security ordeal earlier. She wanted to shake it off, to let herself feel only the thrill of flying. For the first time. But she couldn't forget the way the guard had looked at her father. As they reached the gate, the agent scanned their passes. Her smile thinned as she looked from the ticket to Malcolm. It lasted only a second, but Ava noticed. Malcolm noticed too, though he didn't react. He thanked the woman politely, his voice low and steady, and guided his daughter down the jet bridge. The cabin of the plane smelled faintly of fresh linen and recirculated air. First class was already half full, men in press suits and women in tailored dresses adjusting their bags into overhead bins. A flight attendant with silver hair tucked into a bun stood at the entrance, greeting passengers with a practiced smile. Her name tag read Clara. Her eyes lingered on Malcolm and Ava. "First class?" she asked, her tone light but edged with disbelief. Malcolm handed her their passes without hesitation. "Yes." Clara's eyes flickered over the paper, then back to Malcolm. She hesitated before handing them back, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Welcome aboard," she said, though the warmth in her voice was absent. Ava felt her chest tighten. She looked up at her father, wondering if he would say something, but Malcolm simply nodded, led her down the aisle, and found their seats. He slid his jacket into the compartment above, careful with the crease, then sat down. Ava sat beside him, biting her lip. "Dad," she whispered as she buckled in. Why did she ask like that? Malcolm adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes calm. "Some people ask questions without words," he murmured. "It's not your job to answer them." The hum of conversation filled the cabin. A man across the aisle glanced at Malcolm, then at Ava, curiosity plain in his stare. Malcolm returned it with a measured nod. Unbothered, Ava turned to the window, focusing on the tarmac, where ground crew moved with slow precision. Moments later, Clara returned, offering menus to the row in front. When she reached Malcolm and Ava, she paused. "I'll bring yours later," she said, voice clipped, before moving on. The couple behind them exchanged looks, but said nothing. Ava lowered her eyes, embarrassed. Malcolm leaned back, breathing evenly. He had learned long ago that every slight did not deserve a war, but he also knew to pay attention, to mark the small things, because sometimes they built into something larger. He rested a hand on Ava's notebook, still lying across her lap. "Keep your focus," he told her gently. "Remember why we're here." The minutes stretched. Passengers continued boarding, the shuffle of bags and the click of buckles filling the air. Clara returned to greet a businessman in a crisp gray suit, offering him a glass of champagne before the doors had even closed. Ava noticed the difference, the ease with which Clara smiled at him, the way she leaned in as if he were a guest of honor. She glanced at her father again, but his face remained unreadable. The door shut with a thud. The announcement came: "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." Clara moved down the aisle, checking belts, adjusting bags. When she reached Ava, she tapped the buckle on her lap gently, though her eyes slid past her as if she weren't there. The engines began their low rumble. The plane edged backward, preparing for the taxi. Ava pressed her face to the glass, trying to let her excitement return. She whispered, "It's starting." "Dad." Malcolm smiled faintly, his hand resting on hers. "Yes," he said, "it's starting." Yet in the corner of his vision, he caught Clara's stare again, quick and sharp, a look that wasn't about safety or service, but something else entirely. A message, wordless, but clear. "I don't think you belong here." The plane lifted, the ground falling away. Atlanta shrank beneath them, the cityscape turning into a quilt of streets and lights. Ava gasped, her fear giving way to awe. For her, this was wonder. For Malcolm, it was a reminder the higher you climb, the more some people want to pull you back down. He settled into his seat, calm but alert. Ava sketched hurried lines in her journal, trying to capture the shape of the clouds. Malcolm watched her, his pride steady. He had spent years teaching her how to move through the world with grace, but he also knew grace alone would not always be enough. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Clara passed through again, offering drinks. She skipped their row entirely. Ava raised her hand slightly, hesitated, then let it fall. She turned to her father, whispering, "She forgot us." Malcolm's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "She didn't forget." Ava's eyes widened. "Then why?" "Because sometimes," Malcolm said, his gaze steady, "people need to remind themselves of where they think you belong." He exhaled slowly. "But it's not for them to decide." The rest of the cabin hummed with comfort. Passengers laughed, clinked glasses, shifted in their plush seats, and there, in the midst of it, father and daughter sat quietly, aware of the lines being drawn around them. Small lines, invisible to most, but sharp enough to cut. Malcolm adjusted his watch, the face glinting in the overhead light. He had learned to recognize signs, to see the beginning of storms before the thunder broke. And this, he knew, was only the beginning. Clara Jennings had worked the skies for more than 2 decades. Her record showed experience, long hours, commendations for efficiency. To the airline, she was dependable. A veteran who could handle turbulence in the air and complaints on the ground. To passengers, she often presented a face of polite professionalism, but beneath that surface lay layers built from years of quiet bitterness, unspoken judgments, and an unyielding belief in how the world should look. She had grown up in a small town in Tennessee, where difference was noticed before it was understood. Her father had been a man who believed in order, in tradition, in keeping things as they always had been. Clara carried those values into her adult life, even when she wrapped them in the polished smile of customer service. She didn't see herself as cruel, only as someone who had standards. In her mind, she wasn't unfair. She was simply upholding rules, even rules she never said aloud. As she moved through the first-class cabin, her eyes fell on Malcolm and Ava Reed again. Something about them unsettled her, though she couldn't have explained why if asked directly. They looked composed, presentable, even quiet, but in her mind, they didn't quite fit the picture of who belonged there. The suit Malcolm wore didn't matter. The journal in Ava's hands didn't matter. Clara saw what she wanted to see, and once her mind settled on that image, she rarely let it go. When she poured champagne into the glass of the man across the aisle, she leaned closer, letting her voice warm. When she handed napkins to the couple 2 rows back, she smiled wide enough for dimples to appear. But when she reached Malcolm and Ava, her posture shifted, her face tightened, and her tone thinned. "Do you need something?" she asked, as though the very question were an inconvenience. Malcolm looked up, calm as always. "Water would be fine. For both of us." Clara nodded curtly. "I'll see what I can do." She walked away without another word. Ava shifted in her seat, uncomfortable. She whispered, "Why did she sound like that?" Malcolm rested his hand on the armrest, his voice even, because sometimes people speak from their assumptions, not from their manners. When Clara returned a few minutes later, she placed the glasses down with a quick motion, water sloshing against the rim. Her smile never reached her eyes. Ava murmured thanks anyway, but Clara had already moved on. The small moments added up. A missed menu here, a hurried glance there. Malcolm had seen it before. He had felt it in boardrooms, in hotels, in restaurants where service arrived slowly for him and swiftly for others. But what struck him now was Ava's presence, how she was witnessing it, not through his stories, but with her own eyes. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that her first flight might be filled only with wonder. Instead, it was teaching her a harder lesson. Ava tried to return her focus to her notebook, sketching more diagrams, but the tightness in her chest grew. She had questions she didn't want to ask. She pressed her lips together, glancing at her father, who seemed steady, unmoved. He always seemed steady. Clara continued down the aisle, her voice lifting when she greeted other passengers. She laughed lightly at a joke from a man in a navy blazer. She adjusted the blanket of a woman traveling alone. To anyone else, she appeared attentive. But every time her eyes flicked back toward Malcolm and Ava, a shadow crossed her face. The rhythm of the flight settled into routine. Lights dimmed, trays lowered, the cabin easing into quiet. But inside Ava's mind, questions spun. She wondered if the other passengers noticed. She wondered if they thought the same things Clara seemed to. She wondered if her father always sat through moments like this, silent, breathing deeply, carrying weight she could barely understand. Malcolm felt her unease. He leaned closer, his voice soft enough for only her to hear. Do not let someone else's narrow view shrink you. We're here. We belong here. That's enough. Ava nodded, though her throat felt tight. She scribbled the words in the margin of her notebook, as if writing them down would anchor them. We belong here. Clara returned later to collect trays. She paused at Malcolm's row longer than necessary, her eyes scanning him with a faint squint, like she was searching for a flaw. You're very quiet, she said. It wasn't phrased as kindness. Malcolm looked up at her, his expression unreadable. Sometimes silence says enough. For the first time, Clara's face flickered just a moment of uncertainty, quickly masked. She pressed her lips together and moved on. What Clara did not realize was that passengers around her were starting to notice the contrast. The man in the navy blazer, who had joked with her earlier, glanced toward Malcolm and Ava with curiosity, sensing the undercurrent. The woman with the blanket shifted uneasily. Small ripples moved through the cabin, though no one spoke. Ava leaned against her father, whispering, "Why is she like that to us but not to them?" Malcolm sighed quietly. Because sometimes people confuse service with power, and sometimes, when they think they have power, they forget their duty to serve everyone equally. Ava's brow furrowed. That's not fair. No, Malcolm agreed. It isn't. His eyes stayed fixed forward. But fairness isn't given freely. Sometimes it has to be demanded. The engines hummed steady, the plane cutting through clouds. Inside the cabin, tension built in small increments, subtle enough that most could ignore it, sharp enough that Malcolm knew it would not stay hidden for long. He could feel Clara's glances, could sense the way she lingered near his row, not to offer comfort, but to remind him of her control. He thought of his mother again, of her words. Walk tall, even when you're tired. He straightened slightly in his seat, his hand resting lightly over Ava's. She needed to see him unmoved, unbroken, not because it was easy, but because dignity demanded it. Clara passed once more, checking belts, adjusting trays. When she brushed past Malcolm, her elbow grazed the armrest harder than necessary. Ava's eyes widened. Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply glanced at her, calm and steady, then looked away. It was only a matter of time before the quiet tension erupted. Clara's habits, long practiced and unchecked, were pressing against Malcolm's patience, against Ava's innocence. The storm was forming, and soon it would break. Dinner service began with the usual choreography of clinking trays, soft exchanges, and the faint aroma of reheated meals drifting through the cabin. Ava leaned forward in her seat, curious about the menu she had seen passengers in front of her receive. She had never eaten on a plane before. To her, even the idea of a plastic tray with small compartments felt exciting. Clara moved briskly down the aisle, her expression focused, her posture stiff. She set down trays in quick succession, bending low to ask if passengers wanted wine. Her voice softened when she addressed them. When she reached the row, just ahead of Malcolm and Ava, her tone was warm, conversational. She laughed lightly when the passenger cracked a joke about airplane food, but when she turned toward Malcolm's row, her demeanor shifted again. She placed the tray on Malcolm's table with a thud, not bothering to ask what he preferred. The meal was chicken, though Malcolm had pre-ordered fish when booking the ticket. Clara said nothing about the mix-up, simply moved on to the next row as though nothing had happened. Ava glanced down at her tray. Her father's portion looked incomplete. A small carton of water balanced awkwardly on the corner. She hesitated before whispering, "Dad, didn't you order something else?" Malcolm's gaze lowered to the plate, then lifted calmly to his daughter. "I did," he said softly, "but this is what was given." Clara returned moments later with wine for the man across the aisle. She leaned in, asking if he wanted red or white. When he chose red, she poured with care, holding the stem of the glass so as not to smudge it. Then she turned, her eyes briefly landing on Malcolm. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked flatly, as if the question itself were a chore. "Water is fine," Malcolm said. She placed another small bottle on his tray, then left without waiting for thanks. Ava frowned. She noticed how Clara's smile had returned by the time she reached the next row. She lowered her voice, frustration bubbling in her chest. "Why is she being so rude to us? She's nice to everyone else." Malcolm set his fork down, his voice low, steady. Not everyone treats kindness as a constant. Some treat it as a choice. Ava pushed her food around the tray. "But it's not fair." "No." Malcolm agreed. He lifted the bottle of water, twisted the cap, and poured half into Ava's cup before drinking from the rest. "It isn't." The minutes stretched. The cabin settled into the quiet rhythm of eating, forks scraping against plastic, murmured conversations filling the air. Malcolm ate little, his appetite dulled by the weight pressing silently between them. Ava tried to force a smile, wanting to show her father she was strong, but her shoulders hunched slightly, her pen forgotten beside her journal. Clara passed again, collecting empty trays. When she reached Malcolm's row, she didn't ask if he was finished. She simply took the tray, her fingers brushing against the plate as if rushing him. Malcolm led her, his eyes calm, though a flicker of disappointment crossed Ava's face. "Dad," she whispered, "does this happen to you a lot?" Malcolm's pause was long. "Enough," he said at last. "Enough for me to recognize it when it comes." Ava's chest tightened. She had heard stories from him before, moments of disrespect in hotels or meetings, but seeing it unfold so plainly, so directly, left a sting she hadn't expected. She scribbled in her notebook again, words looping across the page. Some people choose kindness. Some don't. As the cabin lights dimmed, Claire began preparing the aisle for rest. She walked past, her perfume lingering faintly. This time, she paused by Malcolm's seat, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Make sure your daughter doesn't wander around," she said in a clipped tone. "We've had issues before." Malcolm looked up, his expression calm. "My daughter is not an issue." Clara blinked, then forced a tight smile before moving on. Ava's hands balled into fists. "Why does she keep saying things like that?" she asked, her voice breaking. Malcolm reached for her hand, holding it steady. "Because she's testing boundaries, and our choice is how we respond. Inside, though." His mind was stirring. Years of endurance had taught him to measure when to let something pass and when to stand firm. He had built his life on composure, but he knew that Ava was watching. Every word, every silence, every gesture she was learning from him. And this moment, he realized, was not just about him anymore. It was about her. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, grounding himself. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Walk tall, even when you're tired." He looked at Ava, her young face filled with a mixture of confusion and fire. "You're not invisible," he said softly, "even when someone tries to make you feel that way. Remember that." She nodded, her eyes glistening, though she bit her lip to keep from crying. The cabin around them seemed oblivious. Passengers adjusted pillows, scrolled on phones, whispered to one another. But in row 3, the quiet cuts had begun to pile up each glance, each omission, each sharp word layering tension into something heavier. Malcolm leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. He had built companies, faced investors who doubted him, navigated markets that demanded impossible things. But this, the subtle dismantling of dignity in front of his child, felt heavier than any boardroom challenge. Clara's footsteps echoed faintly as she moved back toward the galley. Malcolm opened his eyes again, staring ahead into the dimmed cabin. He knew storms by the sound of the wind before the lightning struck, and this storm was building, one cut at a time. The cabin had quieted into that strange lull of mid-flight, when conversations faded to whispers and passengers sank into their seats, lulled by the steady roar of the engines. Ava leaned back, her eyes heavy though her mind was restless. She tried to distract herself by tracing tiny sketches in her notebook, but every few minutes her eyes drifted to Clara Jennings, whose presence loomed like a shadow across the aisle. It began with something small, as it often did. Ava unbuckled her seatbelt gently and leaned toward her father. "Dad," she whispered, "can I go to the restroom?" Malcolm nodded. "Of course. Take your time." She stood, smoothing her sweater, and walked toward the aisle. But Clara stepped into her path, blocking the narrow space with a tray of cups. Her voice was sharp, though not loud enough yet for everyone to hear. "Not now. Sit back down." Ava hesitated. "I just need to—" Clara cut her off. "I said, sit down. You'll wait until I say it's safe." Malcolm lifted his head, his voice calm. "She's not disturbing anyone. Please let her pass." Clara's eyes narrowed. Her tone shifted, rising so passengers nearby could hear. "Sir, if you don't control your daughter, I will. We can't have children wandering around the cabin." Ava froze, heat flooding her cheeks. She was 15, not a child, and the words stung. Passengers turned their heads, curiosity sparking. The man in the navy blazer looked over, brows raised. The couple across the aisle paused mid-conversation. She's not a child, Malcolm replied evenly. She's a passenger, entitled to use the restroom. Clara's lips thinned. You people always think the rules don't apply to you. The words slipped out like venom. The cabin stilled. A beat of silence spread, heavy and sharp. Ava's stomach dropped. She wanted to disappear, to fold herself into nothing. Malcolm's jaw tightened, though his voice remained measured. We'll not tolerate disrespect. Please step aside. But Clara did not move. Instead, her voice rose higher, firm enough to carry across the cabin. Sit down or I'll have security meet us when we land. Ava's chest tightened. The humiliation was no longer private. It was public, displayed like a warning. She felt the stares, some sympathetic, some judgmental, some curious, as though she were a scene unfolding on a stage. Please, Ava whispered, her voice breaking. Dad, it's okay. Malcolm reached for her hand, steadying her, his eyes locked with Clara's, unflinching. Threats don't make you right, he said softly. They only make you loud. Clara flushed, anger sparking. In one sudden motion, she reached for Ava's arm, as if to push her back into the seat. But Malcolm rose swiftly, his hand intercepting, firm yet restrained. Don't touch her, he said, the calm in his tone edged with steel. Gas rippled through the nearby rows. Someone pulled out a phone, the faint glow of a camera light flickering on. Clara realized too late that others were watching, recording. I'll have you removed from this flight, Clara snapped. Her voice trembled now, not from fear, but from the recognition that her authority was being witnessed and judged. Malcolm's eyes held hers steadily. Do what you think you must, he replied, but you will not put your hands on my daughter. Ava sank back into her seat, her face hot, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. She wanted to scream, to protest, but her father's calm steadiness anchored her. Around them, the cabin buzzed with whispers, phones tilted discreetly, capturing fragments of the exchange. Clara flustered, retreated a step, then tried to regain control. She turned toward the galley, calling out, I need the captain notified. We have a disruptive passenger in row 3. The man in the navy blazer muttered under his breath, That's not what I saw. The woman with the blanket glanced at Ava sympathetically, shaking her head. Malcolm lowered himself back into his seat, exhaling slowly. He placed a hand gently on Ava's back. Breathe, he whispered. Ava nodded, though her chest still ached. She scribbled in her notebook with shaky hands, words tumbling out without thought. They think we don't belong, but we do. We do. The tension lingered heavy in the air. Clara stalked past once more, this time avoiding Malcolm's gaze. Her face was set, her posture stiff, but the flush on her cheeks betrayed the crack in her composure. Malcolm knew the damage had been done. The humiliation was no longer hidden, no longer subtle. It had been shouted into the cabin, thrown across the aisle, etched into his daughter's memory. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. Inside, a storm raged. He had endured insults before, had shouldered slights and swallowed indignities. But watching his daughter, her shoulders hunched, her eyes wet, was a different weight entirely. It was no longer about his dignity. It was about hers. He breathed deeply, his decision forming like steel. Enough patience, enough silence. This would not end with quiet endurance. When Ava leaned into him, whispering, Dad, are we going to be okay? He pressed her hand firmly. Yes, he said, his voice calm and certain. We're going to be more than okay. You'll see." What neither Ava nor Clara realized was that Malcolm had already made his choice. The moment Clara laid hands on his daughter, the quiet restraint that had defined his life shifted into something else. A line had been crossed, one that would not go unanswered. For several minutes after Clara stormed toward the galley, the cabin buzzed with uneasy whispers. Passengers shifted in their seats, phones tilted at discreet angles. Some eyes were sympathetic, others skeptical, but everyone knew they had just witnessed a moment that could not be undone. Ava sat rigid, her fists clenched in her lap, her notebook open but blank. She wanted to write something, anything, but her hands trembled too much. Malcolm sat tall, calm on the outside, though inside his chest burned with a quiet fury. He had endured many slights in his life, but none had ever cut as deep as watching his daughter be humiliated so publicly. His patience had reached its limit, and yet his voice, when he finally spoke, was steady as stone. "Look at me, Ava," he said softly. She turned, her eyes glassy. "You are not what she says you are. You're not small. You're not invisible. You are my daughter, and you belong everywhere you set foot. Do you understand?" Ava nodded weakly, but he could see she was unconvinced. He squeezed her hand firmly. "Sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes we have to show them." Slowly. Malcolm reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers brushed against the sleek surface of the phone that was not just for ordinary calls. It was encrypted, secured, a direct line that connected him to Elijah Torres, his COO and closest confidant. The device was rarely used except in moments of crisis. Tonight, Malcolm decided, it was time. He pressed the screen once, twice, and held it to his ear. Elijah answered within seconds. "Boss, you're still in the air. What's going on?" Malcolm's voice dropped to a whisper, low enough that only Ava could hear. "We've got a situation. North Star Airways, flight attendant Clara Jennings. I want everything logged, recorded, and time-stamped. Get Jake Holloway on the line. He's in training with their crew division." Quietly. Elijah's tone sharpened. "Understood. Do you want me to notify the board?" "Not yet," Malcolm replied. His eyes flicked toward the galley, where Clara was speaking in hushed tones to another attendant. "But prepare them. If this escalates, I want North Star executives aware before we even land." Ava watched her father, her confusion cutting through her tears. "Dad, what are you doing?" she whispered. "Making sure they remember who we are," he said calmly. He reached out and smoothed her braid with one hand, his eyes never leaving Clara. Aaliyah's voice hummed through the line. "Jake's in. He says he's seen Clara before complaints have come in, but none stuck. He'll forward you the file. Want me to start an independent log?" "Yes," Malcolm said. "Record every second from this point forward. If they want a war of perception, we'll give them the truth. With evidence." Elijah hesitated. "You know the weight this carries. Malcolm, this could go wide. Public. You'll be center stage." "I'm not worried about me," Malcolm answered, his voice softer now. He glanced at Ava, who was watching him with wide, anxious eyes. "I'm worried about her." A pause. Then Elijah spoke with conviction. "Consider it done. Stay steady. We'll handle the ground game. You focus on her." The call ended, but its echo lingered. Ava tilted her head, still uncertain. "Is this going to get worse?" Malcolm leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better." Minutes later, Clara reappeared, her face taut, her shoulders squared as though she had gathered reinforcements. Another attendant trailed behind her, a younger man with nervous eyes and a hesitant step. His name tag read Jake. He carried himself differently than Clara, almost reluctant, but she was clearly using his presence as backup. "Sir," Clara began loudly, her voice carrying to the rows behind. "You interfered with crew instructions. This is grounds for removal at landing. I've already notified the captain." Gas fluttered through the cabin. Ava sank lower in her seat, shame prickling her skin. Malcolm remained still, his voice calm. "I did not interfere. I protected my daughter from being mishandled." Clara's face flushed. "That's not how it looked." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to Malcolm, then to Ava. For a moment, his lips parted as if he might speak. Then he pressed them shut, his fear palpable. "Passengers like you cause delays," Clara snapped. "You think the rules don't apply. Well, they do." Malcolm tilted his head, studying her. "And what rule did I break?" The question hung in the air. Clara faltered. She had expected submission, not calm resistance. Her mouth opened, then closed. Behind her, Jake fidgeted, his hands clasping and unclasping nervously. Before Clara could respond, the man in the navy blazer across the aisle cleared his throat. "With all due respect, ma'am," he said firmly, "that's not what I saw. He wasn't disruptive. He was calm. You were the one raising your voice." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. The woman with the blanket nodded faintly. Another passenger leaned forward, phone still recording. Clara's eyes widened, panic flickering for the first time. She glared at the man, then turned back to Malcolm, her voice sharp. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Malcolm's gaze was unwavering. "Respect is simple. You either give it or you don't, and you haven't." Clara's composure cracked. Her voice rose again, shrill. "Enough. I'll have you escorted off myself if I have to." But the tide in the cabin was shifting. Passengers who had once sat silent were watching closely now, their sympathy turning. Clara's authority, once assumed, was slipping. Ava's hand trembled in her lap, but she looked at her father with something new in her eyes, not just fear, but awe. She saw the steadiness in him, the refusal to bend even as the world tried to press him down. Malcolm reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "It's okay," he murmured. "She doesn't decide how this ends." And as he said it, his phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. A message from Elijah lit the screen. All systems in place. Cameras confirm multiple witnesses. FAA contact alerted. You have the ground beneath you. Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time that evening, a spark of resolve flared in his eyes. Clara thought she held power, but she had no idea the weight she had just stirred awake. The air inside the cabin had grown heavier, thick with unease. Every whisper seemed to carry, every glance sharper than it should have been. Clara stood stiff near the galley, her jaw clenched, trying to summon the authority she felt slipping away. She had worked flights long enough to know when passengers turned against a crew member, but she refused to admit it not yet. Malcolm sat in silence, one hand resting lightly over Ova's. His daughter leaned close, her head nearly against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his steadiness. He knew that for her, this moment would leave a mark. She was 15, impressionable, learning what it meant to walk through the world in skin like theirs. And tonight, she was seeing both the cruelty of bias and the necessity of composure. It was then that Jake Holloway, the young attendant who had trailed after Clara, returned. His movements were hesitant, his shoulders slightly hunched as though he carried a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. He stopped near Malcolm's row, his voice quiet. "Sir," he began, glancing at Ava before continuing. I'm sorry for what happened earlier." Clara's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "Jake, not now." But Jake pressed on, his voice firmer this time. It wasn't right. She should have been allowed to go to the restroom. There was no safety issue. It was unnecessary. The cabin stirred with murmurs again. A few passengers nodded subtly, emboldened by his words. Clara's face turned crimson. She stepped toward him, her voice cutting like glass. "Do you want to lose your job?" "Jake, because that's exactly where you're heading." Jake swallowed, his jaw tight. Maybe some jobs aren't worth keeping if it means staying silent. Malcolm studied the young man carefully. There was nervousness in him. Yes, but also a spark of courage. He recognized that look, the look of someone deciding which side of the line they would stand on. He gave Jake a small nod, a silent acknowledgement. Clara turned, scanning the cabin. "You're all being misled. This passenger has been disruptive since boarding. We have protocols. If I say a situation is unsafe, then it is unsafe." The man in the navy blazer spoke again, his voice calm but pointed. "With respect, that's not true. We all saw what happened. He wasn't disruptive. He was calm. You were the one raising your voice." The woman with the blanket leaned forward. "And recording," she added, holding up her phone. The faint light on the screen confirmed her words. "So if this goes further, there's proof." Clara's composure wavered. Her eyes darted from passenger to passenger, realizing she was outnumbered. Yet she still stood straighter, clinging to authority like a lifeline. "Phones can't capture the whole context," she snapped. Malcolm's voice cut through, low and steady. "But truth has a way of making itself seen." Ava looked at him, awe flickering in her eyes despite her fear. She was watching her father not just defend her, but teach her through his calm words, his steady tone, that dignity didn't crumble under attack. Jake shifted again, then lowered his voice so only Malcolm and Ava could hear. "I've seen complaints about Clara before. They usually get buried. She has friends in management. But I can help." Quietly. Malcolm regarded him for a moment, then nodded once. "Do what you can, but be careful. Truth carries weight." Jake nodded, then retreated, his face pale but determined. Clara, fuming, disappeared into the galley. The tension in the cabin didn't vanish, but the shift was undeniable. Malcolm could feel it. The passengers were no longer silent spectators. They were witnesses now, ready to speak if needed. That mattered. Ava leaned close, her whisper trembling. "Dad, is this going to follow us after the flight? What if they try to punish you or me?" Malcolm turned, his eyes softening. "Ava, sometimes when you stand for what's right, there are consequences. But silence has consequences too, ones that last longer. Tonight, you've seen the cost of both." Her eyes glistened, but she nodded. She reached for her pen and wrote in her notebook, her hand steadier this time. Truth carries weight. Minutes passed, the cabin shifting into uneasy quiet. Malcolm could feel his phone buzzing faintly in his pocket. Another message from Elijah. No doubt, waiting for his signal. He let it rest for now. Timing was everything. The story wasn't finished. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Passengers leaned back again, though their eyes occasionally darted toward Clara's shadow in the galley. Ava tucked her notebook into her backpack, then leaned against her father's arm. He smoothed her braid again, a small gesture of comfort, though his own heart burned with a quiet resolve. In the dimmed cabin, one truth was clear. This wasn't just about a rude attendant or a disrupted flight. It was about something larger, the dignity of a child, the weight of silence, the power of witnesses refusing to look away. Malcolm knew this was only the beginning. The real reckoning had yet to come. The cabin had grown eerily quiet. For a while, only the low thrum of engines and the occasional cough broke the silence. Clara had retreated to the galley, pacing, her voice low as she spoke into the intercom. No one could hear her exact words, but passengers could see the agitation in her movements, the way she pressed her lips thin as though trying to reassert control. Malcolm sat still, his hand steady over Ava's. She leaned close, her head against his arm. He could feel the slight tremor in her shoulders, a mix of exhaustion and fear. He rubbed her back gently, though his own mind was sharp, alert. He had not missed the small message Elijah had sent just minutes before. FAA inspector notified, "If this escalates, you won't be alone." Then the announcement came. The captain's voice filled the cabin, formal and precise. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a situation on board, we've been instructed to return to Atlanta. Please remain in your seats." The words hit like a shockwave. Murmurs erupted instantly, spreading from row to row. Passengers sat up straighter, confusion etched on their faces. A woman near the back muttered, "What situation? Everything's fine." The man in the navy blazer shook his head. "Unbelievable." Ava's eyes widened, panic rising in her chest. "Dad!" They're turning back. Malcolm's jaw tightened. He kept his voice calm for her sake. That's what they said. He exhaled slowly, though inside, heat surged through him. A decision had been made to escalate, and it was not his doing. Clara had managed to convince the captain. Clara reappeared, her chin high, her tone clipped. "This disruption can't continue. It's safer for everyone if we return." The couple across the aisle spoke up this time. "Disruption. We've been sitting quietly for an hour," the woman said sharply. "The only raised voice we've heard is yours." Others murmured agreement. Phones tilted upward again, red recording lights glowing faintly in the dim cabin. Malcolm's calm gaze held Clara's. "You've chosen the wrong path," he said quietly. Clara bristled. "I've chosen safety." "Safety isn't what you're after," Malcolm replied, his voice carrying enough for nearby rows to hear. "Control is, but you can't control truth." A hush fell again, passengers drawn in by the quiet certainty of his tone. Clara flushed, her eyes darting, but she said nothing. Ava squeezed his hand tightly, whispering, "What happens when we land? Are they going to take us away?" Malcolm turned to her. "Steady. When we land, the truth will walk with us. That's all we need." But in his mind, he was already moving faster. He slipped his phone into his palm, shielding the screen from others, and tapped a single encrypted message to Elijah Plain, rerouted. "Prepare full release. Within seconds." Elijah replied, "Understood. Files compiling. Press on standby." The engine shifted, the plane banking slightly. Outside, the clouds parted to reveal familiar ground below. Passengers muttered in frustration, some groaning about missed connections. Yet eyes kept flicking toward Malcolm's brow, toward Clara, toward the silent battle playing out. Jake Holloway, the young attendant, returned once more. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting nervously with a stack of napkins. He bent close to Malcolm, his voice hushed. "Sir." I tried to talk to the captain. Clara got to him first. She told him you threatened her. Said you were aggressive. Ava's eyes widened. That's not true, I know, Jake whispered quickly. I told him I didn't see that, but he brushed me off. Said senior staff always take precedence. He broke off, glancing at Clara's sharp stare from the galley. I'll testify if I have to. I'll say what really happened. Malcolm gave him a nod, his gratitude silent but firm. Thank you, he said softly. As Jake hurried back, Clara moved forward again, her voice loud enough for the whole cabin. Passengers, please remain calm. We will be landing shortly, and security will board to handle the situation. The woman with the blanket stood this time, her phone clutched tightly. No, she said loudly. We've all seen what really happened. If security comes for anyone, it shouldn't be them. She gestured at Malcolm and Ava. A ripple of assent moved through the cabin. Several phones lifted higher now, cameras clearly recording. The balance of power had shifted. Clara could feel it. Her authority no longer stood unchallenged. Malcolm leaned toward Ava, his voice low, intimate. Do you see, Ava? One voice speaking truth can spark others. That's how change begins. Ava nodded, tears glistening in her eyes, not from fear now, but from something else. Hope. The descent began, the lights flickering as the cabin prepared for landing. Outside, the skyline of Atlanta came back into view, glowing faintly in the night. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself for what was to come. He knew this would not end at the gate, but he was ready. Beside him, Ava whispered, Dad, are you scared? He opened his eyes, meeting hers. Yes, he said honestly, but fear doesn't decide who we are. Choice does. The landing gear deployed with a heavy thud. The plane descended steadily, every passenger waiting, breath caught between outrage and uncertainty. Clara stood stiff at the front, her arms crossed, her eyes darting nervously to the phones pointed her way. She had wanted control. Instead, she had ignited a reckoning. When the wheels hit the tarmac and the plane slowed, Ava reached for her father's hand again. He clasped it firmly, his voice low and certain. Stay with me, Ava. Whatever happens next, we walk tall. The wheels screeched against the runway, jolting passengers forward as the plane slowed. The familiar thud of landing gear on asphalt should have been comforting, but instead it felt like the tightening of a noose. The lights in the cabin flickered brighter, as if to expose everything that had happened in the last hours. Ava clutched her father's hand tightly, her pulse quick and uneven. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, clipped and formal. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we taxi to the gate. Security will be boarding to address a passenger issue. We ask for your cooperation. Murmurs surged instantly. The couple across the aisle exchanged incredulous looks, while the man in the navy blazer shook his head. Unbelievable, he muttered, his phone still recording. The woman with the blanket leaned forward, whispering fiercely, We'll speak up. They can't just pin this on you. Malcolm said nothing. He sat tall, his jaw firm, his expression calm, though inside he was already preparing. He knew what would happen the moment the plane stopped. Uniformed officers would step on board. Clara would spin her version of the truth, but he also knew that Elijah and his team were already moving pieces on the ground. The moment security arrived, the story would not belong solely to Clara. It would belong to the dozens of witnesses, the recordings, and the systems Malcolm had quietly set in motion. The plane rolled to a stop. The chime rang, and the cabin doors clicked open. Ava's breath caught when she saw 2 airport security officers step in, flanking a supervisor in a dark suit. Clara strode forward to meet them, her expression pinched with self-righteousness. "There," she said sharply, pointing toward Malcolm and Ava. "Row 3. That's the disruptive passenger. He threatened me and disobeyed crew orders." Gasps rose in protest from nearby passengers. The man in the navy blazer stood up. "That's not true," he said firmly. "He was calm the whole time." "She's lying." The woman with the blanket raised her phone higher. "I have it on video. Everything. You should watch before you believe her." Other passengers chimed in, voices overlapping. He didn't do anything wrong. She was the one yelling. "We saw her grab the girl." Clara's face flushed deep red. "They're biased," she snapped. "They're taking his side, because she cut herself off," realizing too late the words she almost said aloud. The supervisor raised a hand. "Enough! We'll sort this out." His gaze shifted to Malcolm, measured but cautious. "Sir, would you come with us to answer a few questions?" Malcolm stood slowly, smoothing his jacket. He gave Ava's hand a reassuring squeeze. "Stay here," he whispered. "No," Ava said instantly, panic rising. "I'm not leaving you." Malcolm met her gaze, steady and unyielding. "You'll be fine. Remember what I told you. Truth has weight. It's already on our side." The officer stepped closer, but Malcolm held up a hand. "Before I go anywhere," he said clearly, "you should know that I've already contacted my company's legal team. Every moment of this flight has been logged and secured. Witness accounts are recorded. If you want to escort me out, you should be prepared for the full record to be reviewed by the FA, the press, and North Star's board of directors." The words landed with force. Passengers murmured again, their voices rising in support. Phones lifted higher, recording every second. Clara's composure cracked. "He's bluffing," she hissed. "He's just trying to scare you." But then Malcolm's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then held it up so the supervisor could see. A message glowed across it, stamped with the seal of the FAA. Inspector Nora Patel notified, "Independent investigation in progress." The supervisor's eyes widened. He looked back at Malcolm, then at Clara. "Slowly," he said. "We're not moving anyone until we review the footage." Relief rippled through the passengers. Ava let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She clutched her notebook to her chest, whispering, "You were right. Dad." Clara's voice cracked with anger. "You can't let him win like this. He undermined me in front of everyone. If we don't act, you're setting a precedent." The supervisor cut her off sharply. "Enough. Ms. Jennings, this isn't about precedent. It's about truth." Clara fell silent, her chest rising and falling in furious bursts. Her eyes darted to Jake, who stood nervously by the galley, his hands twisting in front of him. She hissed, "Say something. Back me up." Jake swallowed hard. His voice trembled at first, but grew stronger. "I can't. Because I saw what happened. And it wasn't him. It was you." The cabin went quiet again. Every eye turned toward the young attendant. Clara's face drained of color. Jake straightened his shoulders, though his hands still shook. She blocked his daughter from using the restroom. She raised her voice. She grabbed her arm. "Mr. Reed stayed calm. He never threatened anyone. That's the truth." The silence broke into low murmurs, many passengers nodding. The supervisor exhaled slowly, his decision clear. "Mr. Reed, you're free to go. Ms. Jennings, You'll need to come with us. Clara's eyes widened. You can't do this to me, she snapped. I've worked here for 20 years. I know the rules better than anyone. The supervisor's gaze was cold, and that's exactly why you should have known better. Clara's protest echoed as the officers guided her off the plane. Some passengers clapped softly. Others muttered under their breath. Ava stared, her eyes wide, struggling to process what had just happened. Malcolm eased back into his seat, pulling her close. It's over now, he murmured, but inside, he knew it wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Clara was just one person, but the system that had protected her for years, the complaints buried. The silence enforced was much larger. Tonight, that system had been cracked open. As passengers began gathering their belongings, many stopped by Malcolm's seat. The man in the navy blazer shook his hand firmly. You handled that with more grace than most of us could. I'll testify if needed. The woman with the blanket pressed her phone into his palm. I'll send you the footage. Whatever you need, I've got it. Others offered nods, murmurs of support. Ava's cheeks flushed, but this time it wasn't from shame. It was from pride. She looked up at her father, whispering, You showed them. Malcolm smiled faintly, smoothing her hair. No, Ava, we showed them. You stood tall, even when it hurt. That's what they'll remember. As they stepped off the plane, into the bright, sterile lights of the terminal, Malcolm's phone buzzed once more. A message from Elijah Media waiting, FIA official en route. You're not walking alone. Malcolm slipped the phone back into his pocket, his hand still holding Ava's. Whatever storm awaited outside those doors, he was ready, because tonight wasn't just about survival. It was about truth breaking free. The terminal lights were blinding after the dim cabin. Ava squinted, clutching her notebook to her chest as she and Malcolm stepped onto the jet bridge. The low murmur of passengers spilled out behind them, voices carrying into the open air of the concourse. Some passengers lingered, phones still raised, determined to capture every second of what was unfolding. Security officers escorted Clara down the opposite side of the bridge, her face twisted with fury. She barked protest, her voice echoing, but no one paid her words the same attention anymore. The tide had shifted. Where once her authority seemed absolute, now she looked small, swallowed by the very system she thought she commanded. Elijah Torres was waiting near the gate, phone in hand, his dark suit immaculate despite the late hour. His eyes scanned Malcolm quickly, then softened as he saw Ava clinging to her father's arm. You okay, Elijah asked quietly. Malcolm gave a brief nod. We're steady. Ava looked up, her voice trembling. Are we in trouble? Elijah crouched slightly so he was level with her eyes. His voice was gentle. No, sweetheart. They're the ones in trouble now. He straightened, his tone shifting. Press is already outside security. FAA is moving faster than I expected. Nora Patel wants to meet you before you give any statement. Malcolm exhaled. Good. Let's keep this clean. The truth speaks loudest when you don't embellish it. As they walked through the terminal, passengers continued to glance their way. Some nodded, some murmured encouragement, others simply watched in silence. Ava felt exposed, but she also felt a flicker of pride. People weren't just staring, they were bearing witness. At the security checkpoint, 2 FAA officials waited, badges visible. Nora Patel stood at the front, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes softened by kindness. She stepped forward, extending a hand. Mr. Reed, I've heard enough already to know we need to investigate immediately. Are you willing to make a formal statement? Yes, Malcolm said without hesitation. His voice carried the weight of a man who had been waiting his whole life for this moment, not this specific incident, but the chance to hold the system accountable. Ava tugged at his sleeve. "Do I have to say something, too?" Nora crouched, her expression warm. "Only if you want to. Ava, you're very brave, but you don't have to speak until you're ready." Ava swallowed, her notebook pressed tightly against her chest. She nodded faintly, but said nothing. Malcolm squeezed her shoulder gently, understanding. They were guided to a quiet lounge, away from the press gathering, like vultures near the main exit. Inside, Malcolm gave his account in clear, measured tones, never once raising his voice. He described the small cuts, the denied menu, the raised voice, the moment Clara had grabbed Ava's arm. Every detail was precise. Elijah supplemented with timestamps, already synced with Reed Systems' secure log. We cross-referenced passengers' phones with internal monitoring data. Everything lines up. This isn't one person's story, it's dozens. Nora nodded, scribbling notes. The videos we've reviewed already confirm as much. Clara Jennings' file shows prior complaints 5. In fact, all dismissed without action. This time, she won't walk away. Malcolm's eyes darkened. It's not just about one person. It's about the structure that protected her. Nora met his gaze. And that's why the FAA is stepping in. This isn't going to be buried. Meanwhile, Ava sat quietly beside her father, listening. She drew in her notebook, her hands steadier now, sketching not brains or diagrams, but people her father standing tall, Clara shrinking under the light, strangers raising their phones like shields of truth. For the first time that night, she smiled faintly. Hours passed. Statements were gathered. Witnesses volunteered recordings. Jake Holloway arrived, pale but resolute, confirming everything he had said on board. "She tried to make me lie," he admitted, his voice shaking. "But I couldn't. Not after what I saw." Malcolm shook his hand firmly. "You did the right thing. That's all that matters." By the time dawn crept across the horizon, the story had already broken wide. Headlines scrolled across airport TVs. Flight attendant accused of discrimination against CEO and daughter. Clips of the confrontation circulated online. Hashtags spreading faster than the airline could respond. "We belong here." Truth carries weight. North Star Airways released a statement before sunrise. The incident involving Ms. Clara Jennings is under full investigation. She has been suspended pending review. We are cooperating with the FAA to ensure accountability and transparency. It was corporate language, polished and restrained. But for once, Malcolm knew the truth behind it would not be swallowed. Too many eyes were watching. Too many voices were speaking. As they prepared to leave the lounge, Elijah leaned close. "Media wants a comment." "You don't have to, but it could set the tone." Malcolm looked at Ava, then back at Elijah. His voice was firm. "We'll say something, but not for spectacle, for clarity." Minutes later, standing before a cluster of microphones and cameras, Malcolm placed a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder. The flashbulbs popped, the air buzzing with anticipation. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "My daughter and I experienced something no family should endure, a reminder that dignity is too often denied because of skin, because of assumption, because of silence. But tonight, silence broke. Passengers stood up. A crew member spoke truth, and the system will answer for it." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "This isn't just about one flight. It's about every person who has been told they don't belong, who has been silenced or humiliated in places they paid to be, worked to be, or earned the right to be. Tonight, I want them to know they are not alone. Truth carries weight, and it will land, no matter how high you try to fly above it. The reporters shouted questions, but Malcolm held up a hand. That's all for now. The FAA has our full cooperation. We trust the investigation to speak louder than any soundbite. With that, he guided Ava through the crowd, ignoring the shouted demands for more. His daughter clung to him, her small smile hidden from cameras but clear to him. As they reached the car, waiting outside, Ava whispered, "Dad, you made them listen." Malcolm kissed her forehead gently. "No, Ava, we made them listen. You stayed strong. That's what turned silence into truth." She opened her notebook once more, scrawling the words across a page. "We made them listen." Malcolm leaned back in the seat, exhaustion finally settling over him, but his heart steadied by the knowledge that this night, painful as it was, had carved something deeper into the world. The fight wasn't over, it never was, but a seed had been planted, and it would grow. The morning after the incident, Atlanta woke to headlines that seemed to flood every screen and newspaper stand. Videos from passengers were everywhere, shared on social media, replayed on morning news shows, dissected on talk radio. The image of Malcolm standing calmly as Clara's voice cut sharply across the cabin had become iconic overnight. Ava's small, frightened face in the background only deepened the outrage. North Star Airways scrambled to contain the damage. Their CEO issued a carefully worded statement, promising swift accountability and systemic review. But the words rang hollow to many, especially after the videos revealed just how blatant the humiliation had been. Hashtags continued trending, with thousands sharing their own stories of being silenced or dismissed while flying. In the quiet of his Atlanta home, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table with Ava beside him. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard Clara's voice again, sharp and belittling. But she also remembered the voices of the passengers, rising in her defense. She flipped through her notebook, where she had written late into the night, "We belong here. Truth carries weight. We made them listen." Elijah arrived just after sunrise, files in hand, his expression grim but focused. "It's bigger than Clara," he said, sliding the papers onto the table. "I dug into the logs. She had at least 5 complaints dismissed in the last 2 years, each one flagged for bias or misconduct. Management covered it up. They didn't want to deal with bad press." Malcolm leaned back, absorbing the words. "So the system shielded her." "Exactly," Elijah replied. "And if they shielded her, you can bet she's not the only one. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern." Ava looked between them, her voice quiet. "So, if people keep getting away with it, how do we stop it?" Malcolm turned to her, his gaze soft but steady. "By making it too costly for them to ignore. That's how change comes." Later that afternoon, Malcolm and Elijah met with Nora Patel at an FAA field office. The room was plain, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, but the atmosphere carried gravity. Nora spread out the evidence across the table: witness statements, video clips, internal reports. "This is enough to warrant a full federal inquiry," she said firmly. "We're not just investigating Clara Jennings. We're looking into North Star's complaint handling process. If they buried legitimate concerns, we'll find out," Elijah added. "Reed Systems is ready to supply independent verification. We already logged passenger video metadata and synced it with your timeline. If they try to erase or manipulate records, we'll catch them." Nora gave Malcolm a long look. "You know this is going to be public. High profile. Once this inquiry starts, your name will be attached to it forever. Malcolm's response was quiet, but certain. That's fine. I've spent my life building systems that keep people safe. If speaking out keeps my daughter and anyone else's child from being humiliated like that again, then it's worth it. For a moment, silence filled the room. Ava's words from the night before echoed in his mind. We made them listen. The following week, hearings began. Malcolm testified before an FAA panel, his composure unwavering as he detailed the sequence of events. He didn't raise his voice, didn't exaggerate. He simply told the truth. The videos did the rest. Passengers who had been on the flight came forward. The man in the navy blazer spoke with quiet authority, describing how Clara's behavior had escalated without provocation. The woman with the blanket showed her footage to the panel, the recording capturing every sharp word Clara had thrown and every calm reply Malcolm had given. Then came Jake Holloway. Nervous at first, his voice shook as he recounted the pressure Clara had placed on him. She told me to back her up, he admitted. She said if I didn't, my job wouldn't last. But I couldn't lie. Not when I saw what she did to that girl. He glanced at Ava, who sat quietly beside her father. She's just a kid. She deserved respect. The room was silent as he finished. Even the panelists paused before continuing their questions. Within weeks, the inquiry released its findings. North Star Airways had systematically ignored complaints of discrimination, prioritizing the protection of senior staff over passenger dignity. Clara Jennings was officially terminated and barred from working in commercial aviation. Several managers who had buried prior complaints resigned under pressure. But Malcolm knew that firing individuals was not enough. He pressed for structural reform, and this time, the momentum was on his side. The FAA announced a new initiative, shaped in part by Malcolm's testimony, the Passenger Dignity Protocol. It required airlines to log and transparently review all passenger complaints, with independent oversight panels ensuring accountability. Training programs on bias and de-escalation became mandatory for all crew. North Star, desperate to salvage its reputation, went further. They invited Malcolm to serve as an advisor on their cultural reform board. Initially, he refused. I don't want to patch a sinking ship, he told Elijah. But Ava surprised him one evening. Maybe you should, she said softly. Malcolm raised a brow. Why? Because you always tell me change doesn't come by walking away. It comes by stepping in, even when it's hard. She held up her notebook, where she had drawn a picture of a plane with people of every shade and shape boarding together. Across the top she had written, all seats earned, all faces welcome. Malcolm stared at the page, his chest tightening. He thought of his mother, her sewing machine humming late at night, her words still echoing. Walk tall, even when you're tired. Ava was carrying that same spirit, passing it back to him. He agreed to join, not as a token face, but as a voice for change. He insisted the reforms go beyond surface-level policies. Complaint systems were redesigned. Independent ombudsmen were assigned to review bias-related cases. Crew training shifted from scripted customer service routines to deeper lessons on dignity, equity, and respect. It wasn't quick, it wasn't perfect, but it was real. Months later, as reforms rolled out, Malcolm and Ava flew again, this time to New York for her scholarship interview. The cabin crew greeted them warmly, and though a flicker of doubt still lingered in Malcolm's chest, Ava smiled freely as she settled into her seat. The attendant, a young woman with a bright voice, bent down and said, "Welcome aboard. Miss Reed, we're honored to have you with us. For the first time in a long while." Malcolm exhaled deeply. Ava leaned toward him and whispered, "It feels different." Malcolm nodded. That's because enough people cared to make it different. As the plane lifted into the sky, Ava opened her notebook one last time. She wrote slowly, carefully. "Fear doesn't decide who we are. Choice does." Malcolm watched her, his heart swelling with pride. This journey had begun with humiliation, but it was ending with hope. And in that hope, he saw the seeds of change not just for his daughter, but for every passenger who had ever been told they didn't belong. The New York skyline glittered in the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the Hudson. For Malcolm, stepping out of the terminal this time felt different. Not a burden, not a test, but something lighter. The weeks of hearings, the weight of testimony, the endless retelling of that night had been exhausting. But now, with Ava walking confidently at his side, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The scholarship interview for Ava had been scheduled at Columbia University, and the campus buzzed with the energy of early spring. Students hurried past with backpacks and coffee cups. Professors strolled in conversation, and the air carried the kind of possibility Malcolm hadn't felt since his own youth. Ava's face glowed with nervous excitement. "Do you think they'll like me?" she asked, smoothing the edges of her notebook. Malcolm smiled softly. "They'll more than like you, Ava. They'll see what I see. Strength, curiosity, and the heart to change things." She blushed, tucking the notebook close to her chest. Inside it were not just sketches of brains and airplanes anymore, but pages of words she had gathered since that flight. Words like truth, choice, dignity, words she was beginning to weave into her own identity. The interview went well better than either of them expected. Ava spoke clearly, her voice steady as she described her dreams of studying neuroscience, her passion for combining medicine with technology, her hope of one day improving healthcare for underserved communities. She mentioned nothing about the flight, nothing about the headlines that had turned her into an unwilling symbol. She wanted to be known for herself, not her trauma. And the panel of professors listened with rapt attention. When they left the building, Elijah was waiting outside, leaning casually against a sleek black car. He grinned when he saw Ava. "So how'd it go?" Ava beamed, the tension melting from her shoulders. I think it went amazing." Malcolm's pride was evident, though his voice remained calm. "She was brilliant." Elijah chuckled. "Of course she was. Runs in the family." As they drove through the city, Elijah turned serious. "Malcolm, the reforms you pushed are already making ripples. 2 other airlines have contacted the FAA about implementing similar systems, and Northstar's training modules. They're being studied as a model for the entire industry." Malcolm exhaled slowly. He had hoped for change, but hearing it confirmed made something inside him unclench. That's good, but it can't stop at airlines. Dignity isn't just for travel, it's for every corner of life. Elijah nodded. "Maybe that's your next fight." Later that evening, they attended a small dinner hosted by community leaders in Harlem. Word of Malcolm's stand had spread far beyond the aviation world. Activists, educators, clergy, and local officials gathered not to praise him, but to talk about what could come next. One elder, Reverend Jacobs, placed a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. "Son, what you did wasn't just for you or your girl. It was for every black parent who's had to watch their child be diminished. You showed that dignity doesn't bow. That matters." Malcolm bowed his head, humbled. "I didn't do it alone." Witnesses stood. Strangers raised their voices. "My daughter." She reminded me why silence isn't an option. The Reverend's eyes softened as he looked at Ava. Then you've already passed the torch. Ava smiled shyly, squeezing her father's hand under the table. For the first time, she felt not like a victim of that flight, but like a thread in something bigger, a story of change that stretched far before her and would continue long after. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of the flight didn't fade, but it transformed. Instead of being a wound, it became a turning point. Clara Jennings disappeared from the news cycle, her name a footnote in the larger conversation about reform. North Star Airways continued restructuring, with Malcolm serving as a quiet but firm voice in their boardroom. He refused photo ops and press tours, focusing instead on the hard, unglamorous work of rewriting policies and ensuring accountability. For Ava, the incident became part of her story, but never her whole story. She threw herself into her studies, poured her heart into applications, and soon an acceptance letter from Columbia arrived in the mail. She cried when she read it, not from fear or shame, but from triumph. On the day she moved into her dorm, Malcolm carried boxes up the stairs, his suit jacket tossed over one arm. Ava laughed as he struggled with a stack of books. "You're supposed to be the strong CEO," she teased. He grinned. "Brains are heavier than they look." They set up her room together, stringing photos along the wall, family snapshots, sketches from her notebook, even a framed print of the words she had written that night after the flight. Truth carries weight. As he hugged her goodbye, Malcolm whispered, "Remember, Ava, fear doesn't decide who you are. Choice does." She hugged him tightly, her voice steady. "I know, Dad. You taught me that evening back in Atlanta." Malcolm sat alone in his study. The house was quiet, without Ava's laughter bouncing off the walls. He poured himself a glass of water and stared out the window at the city lights. He thought of his mother, of her calloused hands guiding fabric through a sewing machine, of the way she told him to walk tall. He thought of Ava, walking onto that plane as a nervous teenager and walking off as someone who had seen her own strength reflected in strangers' courage. And he thought of legacy, not in terms of wealth or reputation, but in terms of the truths we leave behind. The phone buzzed on his desk. "A message from Elijah CNN wants you for a feature on leadership under pressure." "Want me to decline?" Malcolm smiled faintly, typing his reply. "Decline. Let the work speak for itself." Because for Malcolm, the story was never about fame. It was about dignity, about making sure his daughter and children everywhere could walk into a plane, a classroom, a boardroom, or anywhere else, and know they belonged. Weeks later, Ava called from her dorm. She sounded excited. "Dad, guess what? I joined a student group. We're working on equity in education, and they asked me to speak at an event next month." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, pride swelling in his chest. "What will you say?" Ava paused, then laughed softly. "I'll tell them what you told me. That truth carries weight. That fear doesn't decide who we are. Choice does." Malcolm closed his eyes, listening to her voice, knowing she was finding her own way to carry the torch. The world wasn't perfect. It never would be. But as long as people like Ava kept choosing truth over silence, dignity over fear, hope over despair, there was reason to believe. And for Malcolm Reed, that was enough. Life often gives us moments where silence feels safer than speaking out. Yet as this story shows, silence allows injustice to grow stronger. Malcolm Reed did not raise his voice in anger. He chose calm dignity. He didn't fight with rage, he fought with truth. And it was that choice, not just for himself, but for his daughter, that turned humiliation into change. The lesson here is one we can all carry. Respect and dignity are not privileges. They are rights. Whether you are in a boardroom, on a plane, or in your everyday life, standing for what is right doesn't always mean shouting the loudest. Sometimes it means holding your ground with quiet strength, trusting that truth carries its own weight. For older generations watching, this is also a reminder. Our actions teach the next generation how to walk through the world. By choosing courage over silence, we pass on a legacy of resilience and hope. That is something no system of bias or injustice can erase. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and walking through this journey of truth and dignity. Stories like this matter because they remind us that respect is not optional, it's essential. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and push for the change we all deserve.